Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode on Genealogy TV. This is actually a podcast. My sidekick, Ashley, is here today.
Hey guys.
We are talking about vital records. And so, Ashley, exactly what does that mean, vital records? For people who are so new to genealogy, they might not know.
So, vital records are really a foundation of what a lot of people build their trees on now. It stands for birth, marriage, and death are usually the three that we go to. They're usually the documents that you might receive when you order them from the state. They're issued, I think, starting in the early 1900s, right, Connie?
Yeah, so it kind of depends, birth and death records, excuse me, typically in the United States started in the early 1900s, around 1908-ish, depending on the state. And for some states, the compliance didn't happen until they may have been mandated like in 1912, but they didn't get around to actually getting it done until the late 1920s in some cases. Most of them were in compliant, in the mid 19 teens, but a lot of them were created at the county level, so sometimes you're still looking for them at the county level as well.
Hmm.
So, some of the stuff you can find in those records are the name of the child, obviously, especially on a birth record, the date, place of birth, the parents' names, including the mother's maiden name a lot of times, which can be sometimes the only thing we can find. Occasionally, usually, not always, but you get the parents' birthplaces. The father might even have his occupation on there. It just kind of depends. So, some of the clues you might be looking for, Ashley, might be what on a birth certificate?
Oh gosh, I would say giving you time frames for a lot of things. You can definitely check to see. I don't know if there's a standard, but in a lot of states, they do indicate the place of birth for even the parents, even if it's just the state. So that can give you some great clues as to where to look next. You can, like you said, with the mother's maiden name, that could lead you down some information. So those are just offhand some of the things that I know of. If there's an attending physician or a doctor, that might help you if you're looking for particular information too.
Yeah, sometimes you might even see the hospital they were born at, some of that kind of information. The I think one of the foundations of birth certificates, if we're talking specifically about birth certificates,
Hmm.
not talking about evidence of birth, that's a completely different conversation, but birth certificates are typically really good quality records as far as when we're thinking about primary or secondary evidence because it's the parents that are giving the information. They witnessed the event, they participated in the event. And
Hmm.
so a lot of times that information is really pretty accurate. Occasionally, you might get other people listed on there,
Hmm.
like godparents or grandparents. Not that often. Usually you might see that, especially I find if we're starting to step away from birth certificates in the United States, but go to things like birth registries outside of the United States, a lot of times we'll see in those birth registries, and a lot of times these are church records if we're getting back into the 1700s, the godparents are listed or witnesses or other participating family. And they're not always my experience has been that the relationship is not always there, but a lot of times you'll figure out the relationship later on. So, not to go down a different rabbit hole because we're talking about vital records. And one of the things we probably need to think about too is separation of church and state,
Hmm.
right? A lot of times in the United States, all of these vital records, birth, marriage, and death, when they're like after 1900, let's just use that as a general rule of thumb, those are often civil records. And a lot of times when we get back before civil records were created, those records are held at the church level a lot of times, or maybe the county registries. Some of the other places people might be thinking about, I like to use the term evidence of, because a lot of times, let's face it, the early 1900s and all of the 1900s, really, when we're looking for those vital records of any kind, we're starting to work backwards in our family history, and we get before 1900, we're like, I want that birth certificate. Well, it may not exist.
Mhm.
So you have to go where, Miss Ashley, to find out when birth certificates were created.
So, a great resource that I think is sometimes underutilized just because a lot of people don't know the Family Search Research Wiki. If you use that, it can be a huge time saver. It can really keep you from spinning your wheels because you can find where things are and when they were created.
I did a survey recently on the YouTube channel, and I said, how many people are using just ancestry.com? How many
Mhm,
people are using just Family Search? How many people are using both?
mhm.
And about 50 some percent, I think it was like 57 or 58% the last time I looked at it, there was well over 600 votes. We're using both. Bravo to you. Or
Yes.
both. I was saying Ancestry and Family Search or other platform.
Mm,
So just to be clear, that could include my heritage or 23andMe or all the different platforms, WikiTree, those kind of
mhm,
things. So as we're sitting there thinking about it, but there's like 30 some percent that are only on Ancestry. And boy, you know, FamilySearch.org is one of the best resources that a person can use, and it's free. And there's no obligation of any kind. Nobody's going to be spamming you with emails or anything. And so I highly recommend people get signed up with the FamilySearch.org website. And if you don't even, I know a lot of people have a problem with the collaborative tree. And for those who are brand new, Family Search is a collaborative tree. Everybody's contributing to the world's largest family tree. And some people have a problem with that because they might put their stuff up there and it gets changed. Not to go down this rabbit hole, but I'm getting back to the wiki. The wiki is probably my first go-to. I would say Cindy's List is probably my second go-to, but
mhm,
Family Search Wiki is being updated by thousands of volunteers every day. And so if you go to search and you drop down to the research wiki and you drill into the location that you are searching, let's get all the way down to at least the state level, it will start to give you information about what's available, what records are available, whether it's on Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, whatever platform it is, it'll
mhm,
give you a hyperlink to go find those records. And it is awesome. And
mhm,
so when we're trying to find the death records, any vital record, go to the Family Search Wiki, drill into the location all the way to the county level, wherever the county is that you suspect that your ancestor was born, because we're still talking about birth records,
mhm.
and see when those records were created. And it'll give you a little box and it'll tell you birth, marriage, death, and there's some other records that it shows you when these records began. And it can be very helpful because a lot of people get really frustrated, especially when they're new.
Oh, yeah.
They can get really frustrated with, "Why can't I find the birth certificate?" Well, they were born in 1882. They didn't exist.
Yes.
So then what do? We go look for evidence of the birth. And so
Yes.
that might come in the form of church records, baptisms, christenings, birth registries, maybe at the county level before the actual certificates were being created, census records, family Bibles, any kind of family artifact. In our family, we even have a quilt that
Oh,
has people's
wow.
names and it'll have like birth and death dates on there, years. That may be the only record that survives, right? Is the quilt.
Mhm.
So you can access a lot of this stuff on Ancestry, Family Search. I don't know so much about my heritage for vital records, the county, but here's the trick. If you're an Ancestry only user, and you're not finding what you look for, go look for it on Family Search because, especially with marriage records, as we transition over into marriage records now, marriage records are very important to the Mormons who created the Family Search website. And so they have gone to great lengths
Mhm.
to find the marriage certificates, to find the marriage records, the marriage registries. They have the images that Ancestry might not have. So let's talk about marriage for a second.
And one quick thing before we jump into marriage,
Mhm.
delayed birth, uh, delayed
You're
birth
right.
certificates. Yeah,
I'm
just
glad
because
you mentioned that.
it was something that I didn't really know about early on because sometimes we just think in our own context, well, of course you have a birth certificate. You know, it
I'm
might.
glad you mentioned that because I totally skipped over that. So let's talk about that for a second because why are there delayed birth certificates? They could be in a couple different reasons. A,
Yeah.
in
Mhm.
the 1930s, Social Security came along, about 1935, 1936, somewhere in there. A lot of people didn't have birth certificates when Social Security was enacted.
Mhm.
So they want Social Security benefits. And it was kind of a requirement, I believe, that everybody get a Social Security card at one point. And so they had to go get a delayed birth certificate. My grandmother was a perfect example. And the delayed birth certificates are really awesome because they have more information than a regular birth certificate. So, my experience with my own grandmother was that she went and got a delayed birth certificate. And when you go to get a delayed birth certificate, in order to prove your age, you had to get testimonies from at least 3 different locations, 3 different sources.
Mm.
So her mother was one of them who said, "Yes, I gave birth to this child in this time." The other was the school superintendent, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Mhm.
And another was a neighbor who said, "I've known this person my whole life, and I know this date to be true." And it was typed, like, squeezed in there, you know? I think my father was a 4th one.
Yeah.
And so all this information was kinda squeezed in there into these little tiny boxes, but there was a ton of information. The neighbor, for example, we could then go confirm a census record with
Mhm.
the neighbor information, right? I mean, there's
Mhm.
so many different ways to, slice this cake, so
Yep. Fan
yeah, I'm
club.
glad you mentioned that, I completely forgot about it. You ready to go on to marriage records now? Did I forget anything?
Oh, no, I just mentioned, like you were saying with the neighbor fan club, all of that, those strategies can kinda weave in.
All right. So marriage certificates are a little bit different. And they're highly reliable, really, because it's usually the couple that's getting married that supplies the information. So they're giving information about themselves. So that's pretty reliable information. And marriage records often go back farther than birth and death certificates. So a lot of times you'll have a certificate of marriage back
Mhm.
into the mid 1800s. I've seen some way back into the early 1800s. There are, in some cases, even into the 1700s, but it just depends on the location. As our friend, the legal genealogist Judy Russell always says, it depends.
Depends. Yeah.
It's so true. So it just kind of depends. But you can have all kinds of different marriage records. Can you name
Mhm.
a few, Miss Ashley?
You can have things. It's not necessarily a certificate, but, depending on your faith or your denomination, there's marriage bands.
Hmm.
Those can be posted usually outside of a church, or they might make an announcement to their congregation, for the intent for the couple. Let's see. We have, the license itself and then a marriage return. So, that can be when you're completed the ceremony, and if it's been either documented civilly or anything like that, where you have an evidence that it has happened and the marriage is officiated.
Yeah, so a lot of times, and again, as we're thinking about evidence of the event, a lot of times you'll see the marriage license and the marriage return on the same form. And a lot of people don't understand or don't realize,
Mhm.
pay attention to the dates. Because the marriage license, a lot of times people will put in their family tree the marriage license date thinking that is the date they got married, and it's not
Mhm.
necessarily so. They could have gotten their license a week ahead of time and
Mhm.
then went and got married the following Saturday,
Mhm.
and then the minister returns the document to the county, and that's what the marriage return is, meaning it's completed. So the marriage license is an intent to marry, whereas the marriage return says, yes, it happened. And you can also have a marriage bond, and this is typically in the southern United States, where basically what that was an assurance that the groom was not previously married. And so there usually has to be a witness or two, actually a bondsman, that stands up with the groom and
Mm.
says, we pledge this bond, which a lot of times is like $500 or something,
Mhm.
that says that this groom is eligible to get married. In other words, he is not previously married or currently married. I guess he could have been previously married and his wife died, that would still make him eligible. But if he was married in another state or something and he really couldn't legally get married, that's what the bond is about. So they didn't actually pay the $500 on the bond. Different bonds, different prices. But
Is it like a promissory type thing?
yeah, basically, an insurance policy. Basically,
Mhm.
they're saying if me, the groom, and let's say I'm the groom, and I and my brother put up this bond, it's just signing your name on this bond saying, "I'm eligible to get married." But if, for some reason, that the groom is actually already married, like he's living a double life,
Mhm.
then and he gets caught, he's gonna pay that $500 or get thrown in jail.
Mm.
So because it was against the law. So that the bond is, a lot of times was just an assurance thing. So some of that stuff you might find on that information is the bride and groom's name, including a lot of times the maiden name, or if it's her second or third marriage, her married name from her previous marriage may be on there. So if, for example, if her husband died and she's remarrying, her married name may be on there. So be aware of that, because as we're discovering stuff, sometimes we're discovering the most recent information, and we might think that the bride's maiden name is her previous married name. So we just kind of have to pay attention to that. It just depends
Mhm.
on the document. If you're lucky, you might find birth dates on there. A lot of times it's just ages, the bride and groom, they're 21 years old or whatever. So you kind of have to estimate their birth date if you don't already have it. Sometimes the parents' names, I've seen some that the parents are never on. They're not on there, but the witnesses are. That's another thing. Pay attention to the witnesses. Why, Miss Ashley?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the witnesses, again, can tie into the fan club. The witnesses can really give you clues as to how they're living their life or, who they're spending their time with, just like you and your own social life.
A lot of times you'll see family as witnesses, like a sister or something.
Mhm.
I've seen parents as witnesses as well.
Really?
Yeah, not very
Oh.
often. I usually see a sister and a friend. It's
Mhm.
like, because usually got to have two witnesses.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the minister's wife, if it's a very small
Um,
wedding, but it just depends. So the reliability of the information on a marriage document is usually very accurate. So that would be primary information, firsthand knowledge. So just keep an eye out for multiple marriages. On marriage certificates, a lot of times you will see there's a little, this is why you got to pay attention to the details. You'll see a little tiny box that says how many marriages, or something like that, are previously
mhm.
married, and you might see a two. And it's like,
Mhm.
"Oh, this person's been married twice before," you know?
Mhm.
And so, that can be clues. And a lot of times you'll be able to verify this stuff. Of course, we're working backwards. We're talking forwards because we started with birth and now we're into marriage, but when you're doing your research, you really wanna start with death records and work backwards. So, if we can't find a marriage certificate, or let's say we can't even find a marriage registry, where else could we look?
I would say you can look in newspapers, especially if there's just an announcement that the license has been applied for. Sometimes that's just all you'll get. I've seen where it just is a small little post or a little article in the newspapers where it just lists a name of people who've applied, and that's it.
Church records is another great one because I know depending on the denomination of the church, sometimes the couple had to go before the church and say, "We intend to get married." And sometimes that's recorded. I know in the Quaker religion, because I do a lot of Quaker research, there's like 7 steps. They had to go to his church and say, "We intend to get married." They had to do that like 2 or 3 times. And then they go over to the bride's church and say, "Hey, we intend to get married." And they had to do that a couple times. And then, there's just all of these different little things that they had to do in order to get married in the eyes of the church. And then there's others. So if you're following the Quaker records, if you find one, you can go forward and backwards in time to go, let's see if we can find all of the intent to get married notices. Let's see if we can find all of the, because there's even records where they get married, like the church says, okay, you're good to go,
Mhm.
right? There's a record of that because nobody's come up and objected to this marriage. And then there is in the Quaker religion, there's people that actually go to the wedding to make sure it is performed according to the doctrine of the church.
Mm.
Because if there's too much dancing and too much drinking and, all that kind of stuff, then that is against their belief. And so that gets reported back to the church in the minutes. And so, I mean, there's just, it depends on the religion and how much of that is documented. But
Mhm.
so again, it depends. Other evidence of a marriage could be,
I would say, well, it's again working backwards, but a divorce decree.
oh, yes, good point.
Mhm.
Sometimes the divorce record's the only evidence you ever find. I've seen that.
Yep.
Probate records.
Oh, yeah.
So if you happen to come across the probate record, now, again, depending on place and time, you might find evidence of a marriage in a probate package where, let's say, a father is wanting to hand down a portion of his estate to his daughter, but she's married,
Mhm.
and that married woman cannot own land, so it goes to her husband.
Mhm.
And so a lot of times it will name her, my daughter Rebecca's husband, Joe,
Mhm.
and his last name, whatever that is. And so that information sometimes is found in a probate record. But here's the thing, if you find it, here's my chronological brain working. If you find a probate record that names the daughter and her husband, we know that they got married prior to the date of this probate package.
Mhm.
So now we've got an end date, at least, as to the range of time in which we're looking for that marriage record. So, yeah, lots of tips. I could go on. Marriage records are probably, I would say, my number one source for marriage records is FamilySearch, just because they're so into um, marriage records. Let's just leave it at that. A lot of times, if you're an Ancestry user and you're one of those 37% that only use Ancestry, and you find a marriage index, a lot of times you're not going to see the image, but you're going to see, Jane and Joe Doe married, and they've got some information there. Go over to Family Search and find the record because they probably have it. If it's indexed, Family Search most likely is going to have the actual image, which may contain more information. So, again, think about with any record you're searching, think about where was the record created? And all vital records are mostly at the county level. Sometimes they've moved to the state. If they're really old, sometimes they've gone to the state archives.
And if you happen to catch it, sometimes, I don't know if it's in every index, but I've seen some where they actually list the certificate number.
Oh, bingo. Or the FHL number.
Oh, right, yes, the FHL number. Mhm.
That's even better sometimes because, well, both. Because if you get an FHL number, what does that mean? Family History Library is what the
Mhm.
FHL number stands for. You grab that number and then go over to Family Search and you search by FHL number, which
Mhm.
is when you go to the search tab and you go to records, there's a right-hand tab that says find by, no, that's find by ID. I'm confusing that with one of those has got at the bottom, it's got FHL number and you can plug that number in and it'll take you to the roll.
Mhm.
Now you can take a look at the roll. It's not going to take you to the exact page, but it's going to take you to the roll and you're going to have to go, okay, how is this organized? A lot of times they're organized in chronological order. So
Mhm.
if you go and you scroll through and you go, "Okay, I'm looking for a marriage in 1852. Okay, I'm in 1828. Alright, I need to scroll forward a lot."
Hop, skip, jump.
Yeah, exactly, and
Mhm.
skip on down to the dates that you're searching, and then sometimes you just a lot of times this is at the county level, so it's not gonna be how many marriages could possibly be in 1852? You might have to scroll through, a few
Mhm.
dozen, but, you'll find it most likely doing that. Shall we talk about death records?
Yeah, that is a huge thing, especially because we work backwards.
Amen to that. I've done another episode on death records and also lessons at the Genealogy TV Academy that really took a deep dive into the death record stuff. But here's the thing about death records. And I mean, there's good and bad about death records.
Mhm.
One is by the time someone dies, they've lived a full life. They've got tons of things that have been left behind in records and in possessions. And there is more, I should say, there are more death records than any other type of record out there. Now, vital records, when we're talking specifically about vital records, a lot of times we're talking about death certificates. But again, we want to go to that Family Search Wiki and find out when the death certificates began in the area in which you're searching. But there are bazillion different types of death records that you can find. Can you name a few, Miss Ashley?
Oh gosh, there are, let's see,
And we're not talking just death certificates, evidence
right,
of death.
evidence of death. Yeah, so that's why I'm trying to pull like all these things that are just available. So you've got obituaries that might be posted, cemetery records, funeral home records. Again, probate, because obviously if they're dividing up an estate,
Mhm.
that's going to be evidence. If you're talking about church records, you could have any kind of records for their burials, mortality schedules. There's even one that I found, I shared with you when we were talking about the different variety of death records. I found a death return that was from 1876. Mind you, this was a record from an older city. So, I think paying attention to those time frames and figuring out when things are available. But
I
these
had
are,
never heard of a death return before until you shared that with me, and I'm only assuming that it is just like a marriage return that the official person is returning the death certificate to the county. But that I thought that was fascinating. I hadn't really seen a death record quite like that before. We also have
yeah.
things like tombstones, doesn't mean they're accurate, but, gosh, there's just so many. You could have obituaries, I think you mentioned.
Mhm.
So, let's talk about some of the things we wanna look at. Let's start with death certificates. What do we wanna look for when we are looking at a death certificate?
So obviously, you want to just double check the information, correlate it as best as you can. A key thing that I often pay attention to is the informant,
Bingo.
because that can give you some context about the reliability, or just, if they don't know something, there's probably a reason.
So, people need to remember too that almost any death record with the exception of maybe a probate record
Hmm.
is really secondhand knowledge. So therefore it's not primary information. Why? Because the person that it's about is dead and they're not personally giving the information. So a lot of times that informant that you mentioned could be a sister, could be a child. They didn't witness the birth. Therefore, the birth information on that death certificate may not be accurate. It could be very well be accurate, but we just have to keep that in mind as we're sitting there thinking about it. And one of the other ones that we could talk about too, as far as evidence of death, is mortality schedules. So, mortality schedules in the United States were created in 1858 through 1860, 1870, and 1880. So they were only in the pr so people listed in the mortality schedules were only for the 365 days prior to the enumeration date. Therefore, pay attention to the enumeration date on the 18th, let's say it's 1850 you're looking at. The 1850 census, say I don't remember what it is. Let's say it's June 1st or April 1st. Let's say it's April 1st because I
Right.
think it might be. I don't remember offhand.
Hmm.
But that means that the 365 days prior to, if a person died, then within that 365 days, they would be listed. But if not, if they died in January the previous year, they're not going to be listed. So, but mortality schedules can have more information. So that's always fun. I think we hit some of the big ones on the death certificates, I would say the number one thing is look at the informant. Who is the informant? And what is their relationship? Do you know it? Sometimes it'll say what the relationship is, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's a spouse, but even a spouse didn't witness the birth of that person. So
Of
the
course.
birth information may not be firsthand knowledge, but the death information might be because they may have witnessed the death. So that information could be considered more accurate than the birth information or the parents' names, right? I see this a
Mhm.
lot. So they, or maybe the spouse gave the deceased person's parents' names, but he knew it as a nickname, like Janie, when her full name was Genevieve or something, you know? And so he or she may not have known what their spouse's original first birth name or maiden name was when noting that information. Or they may not, sometimes you'll see death certificates where it'll say the parents' names and where they were born.
Mhm.
And that information, sometimes it just says unknown, but it might not be perfectly accurate either. So, I mean, we just kind of have to take death records as you know, kind of a keeping in mind that it might not be accurate. So,
Yeah. Just taking that with a grain of salt and, again, verify, you know?
yeah. So as you're looking at any of these vital records, just keep in mind what would be considered primary and what is secondary information. I mean, really, that's really what it comes down to is the type of information that you're seeing on there. Also, for some people who really get into more of a professional level, you want to start looking at whether it is a original copy or if it's a
Mhm.
derivative copy, meaning it's a copy of the original. And a lot of times with vital records, you're looking at copies.
Mhm.
So if it's more recent, you're going to see a computer printout where somebody's typed this information in and they're spitting out a computer copy. That's fine.
Mhm.
When we get back into the older records where everything's handwritten, you can evaluate, you know, do the signatures look original?
Mhm.
Especially on a marriage certificate, you might get a signature of the bride and the groom. So, I mean, you kind of have to start thinking about, is this a copy? Why do we care if it's a copy? Because if it's a handwritten copy, then it could be that the information that the person was copying down is incorrect. I have actually from my great grandparents 2 marriage certificates.
Mm.
One is the handwritten note that I got from I think it was the county in Wyoming. They sent it to me when I ordered a copy of their marriage license. It was from the 1800s. And it was like just a sheet of paper that was handwritten. Well, it turns out after doing much evaluation that this is the minister's handwritten note that he carried back to the county. And instead of creating a beautiful certificate, he handed them this note.
Mm.
Well, I met a cousin years later who had the original marriage certificate that was given to the bride and groom. It's beautiful. It's got all this ornate stuff around the outside
Oh, wow.
that the same minister hand wrote, but the cousin had the original marriage certificate. Now this is a decorative copy, kind of thing you'd hang on the wall because it was
Mhm.
big, but it had more information, it had more accurate information. I
Mhm.
don't know what happened with the minister and when he, like, maybe wrote it down 2 days later, oh, yeah, he spelled the name wrong, like, it was
Oh.
Madsen, S-O-N versus S-E-N. So, I mean, just little tiny things like that, but that's what the county has,
Mhm.
and the county has the name spelled wrong, so, you know, just little details like that, so
Yeah. I think we talked about this too, speaking of some of the information you've gotten through your family or for your family. One of the things that I needed to know or wanted to know about my great-grandparents was where they had gotten married because they lived and died in the same city, and that's where, a lot of for generations, my family had been. And I found out that they had gone to a justice of peace out of state. They got married, And I looked at the age, and it didn't really add up for my great-grandmom, and there was, debate about what age she actually was when she passed. So, I'm looking at her marriage certificate, and I'm like, "Well, like you said, she gave this information and, was telling them when she was born, all the information they might ask." And then I ordered a copy of her birth certificate because she was born in 1920, I believe. 20 or
Close
22,
enough.
I'd have to look. I looked at that and I went, "Oh, that's not right." She fibbed about her age to get married, and it's like, well, why would any woman wanna make themselves 2 years older? And it was so that she could get married.
She was probably underage,
She was
and
17.
that's another good point. So, as you're looking at marriage certificates, let's say you're scrolling through a microfilm roll and you see a sheet of paper that
Mhm.
is covering up part of the document.
Yes, if it's layered.
Go to the next page, roll forward one page because more than likely they have turned that over, and it is a lot of times you'll see where the parents are giving permission for this person
Mhm,
to get married, but they have to photograph it with that sheet of paper on there first, and you think, "Oh, they're hiding stuff. They're covering things up." Not necessarily. Go to the next page. They'll have flipped it over and
mhm,
photograph that same page again,
mhm.
and, yeah, I've seen that many times. Going to your story about parents getting, grandparents, I think it was, getting married out
Great-grandparents,
of
yeah.
state, my parents did that. It was very common. My parents were born and raised in Los Angeles area, and it was very common for couples getting married, especially if they were running away, right,
Mhm,
to go to Las
eloping.
Vegas and get married, and because it was a 5-hour drive from LA, and so people would run off to Las Vegas, different state, different county, right? Get married and, come back and, live their life as a married couple, but, if you were looking for that marriage in Los Angeles County and you can't find anywhere in Southern California, they often ran off to Las Vegas to get married, have fun for a few days, and come back.
Mm,
I remember my parents saying when they got home, I think she said they had 50 cents left in their pocket. They had no money.
oh my
And so
gosh.
it took them everything they could to pay for gas to get to Las Vegas, get married, and come home. So I thought that was a cute story. Anyway.
My great-grandparents, they went to Elkton, Maryland because, they lived in Philly, and apparently that is, a very, very popular place for people to go if they just wanna get, quickly married, and they got married on April Fool's Day.
Oh, that's so April Fools.
Yep.
We didn't mean it. We're just joking. That's too funny.
Isn't it cute? I was laughing so hard
Oh,
when I
that
looked
is
at that, I
so
was like,
funny.
"Really?"
Well, I think we've pretty much covered it. Can you think of anything else we need to share about vital records?
No,
Pay
I think
attention to the details, look to the
yes,
informant,
yes.
go to the FamilySearch Wiki to figure out when the records existed because they may not even exist.
Mm.
If they're in the South, the county records may have been burned during the Civil War. You know, you just gotta find out if they even survived or not.
Oh, yes, and, speaking of locations, if you depending on how far back you're going, I would say county, lines, if they've changed or when they were created,
We didn't even
because
talk about that. You're right, absolutely.
yeah, 'cause
And
I
where are you gonna
mean
find out when the county lines changed? FamilySearch Wiki.
yes, absolutely, Family Search Wiki is a huge, huge help.
There's, I think it's mapofus.org. I think they still
Mm,
have, and I think Allen County Library has an interactive map too that kinda shows. I haven't looked in there recently. I know that it was offline for a while on the Allen County Library. It may be back on, so if anybody listening or watching knows, put it in the comments for everybody, and we'll pin that comment. But, yeah, so, just find out those border changes because it might be that they married in a different county but never moved because the borders changed over time.
absolutely.
Well, this is fun. Hopefully, people got some good information out of some of our information. I know we kinda went off the deep end. It was more we originally were just gonna talk about civil records, but, you gotta talk about evidence of of these events, even if it's not the actual marriage, birth, death certificates,
Mhm.
because there's a lot of evidence out there. All right, we'll see y'all in the next episode. Thanks for watching.
Thanks. Like and subscribe.